What if I told you that this book here, 1,178 pages long, didn't tell you the true story of The Lord of the Rings? Oh, it's got all 3 books, Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King, all the appendices, translation guides for Elvish, family trees, and Tolkien's many maps, but still, it doesn't tell the full true story. And this is all thanks to a small part of Tolkien's world building that you've probably never heard of, called the Red Book of Westmarch. And my friends, if you are up for a little bit of world building yourself, then do try out the totally free version of the writing and world building software Campfire, down at the links in the doobly-doo below. They are today's sponsor, helps the channel. You'll remember that Bilbo and Frodo both write accounts of their stories in a big red leather book.
And then find somewhere quiet where I can finish my book.
Bilbo's story would become what we know as The Hobbit, although he called it There and Back Again, and Frodo's story comprises what we call The Lord of the Rings, though he also gave it a different title. At one point, it was the hilariously understated What We Did During the War. We're also told that Bilbo gave Frodo 3 books of lore that he had made at various times, written in his spidery hand and labelled on their red backs, Translations from the Elvish by B.B. It's not quite clear what these translations were, but they included poems, and it's implied that they're what we find in the Silmarillion. They were almost entirely concerned with the Elder Days. The Elder Days being the First and Second Age before the whole War of the Ring nonsense, which is detailed in books like The History of Middle-earth, The Lost Tales, and of course, the Silmarillion, which is kinda like Tolkien's Bible. It's got the creation story, moral teachings even, and the stories of all the major figures of history, good and bad, that came before. Bilbo translated the historical records found in Rivendell, as well as spoke to many elves who remembered the ages past, sometimes first-hand, but also second or third-hand, those that had stories of stories. There were also a number of other writings, stories, and appendices that were added at various points. All of these were apparently brought together into a book known as the Red Book of Westmarch, an historical record in the world of Middle-earth itself recounting these stories and histories. There's a complex genealogy for how it all ended up as a book, which if you're interested, there's a link down in the description for you to read more, but all you need to know is that the original Red Book was in time lost, but copies were made and passed down through the generations, with copies ending up in Gondor and Rohan and the Shire. If you didn't know, Tolkien wanted to create a mythology for Britain of sorts, like the Norse or the Greeks have. So he imagined in some way that Middle-earth was an era of Europe long forgotten, until he discovered a copy of the Red Book in the early 1900s, which he translated and published. At least this was Tolkien's deliberate author conceit, even going so far as to tell people that the Red Book he found was tragically destroyed in an office fire. All of this means that the very copy of the book you hold in your hands is an item of the lore of Middle-earth. It's just the latest copy of the Red Book of Westmarch. And Tolkien's work across his lifetime is that of uncovering an ancient lost history of Europe. Isn't that just so damn cool? It's a kind of meta world building. There's a reason that this story is being told and recorded and written, and that we now read it in the lore. But all of this means is that in the lore itself, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and particularly the Silmarillion are written from the perspective of an unreliable narrator. There are dozens of lines which tell us how flawed or incorrect these accounts were when they were written. Only here in the Shire were to be found extensive materials for the history of Numenor and the arising of Sauron, with a tale of years. Though the dates given are often conjectural, especially for the Second Age, they deserve attention. This tells us directly that the timeline we think we know is not fact. It's people guessing, it's debatable, and there are a lot of lines like this when you look for them. In Minas Tirith, the Red Book received much annotation and many corrections, especially of names, words, and quotations in the Elvish languages, and there was added to it an abbreviated version of those parts of the tale of Aragorn and Arwen which lie outside the account of the war. After Frodo put the original book together, a copy ended up in Minas Tirith, where scholars corrected Frodo's understanding and depiction of a lot of things, including Elvish and Gondorian culture. And if that's the case, then what else did Frodo, Bilbo, or Sam get wrong? So much of Lord of the Rings details the ventures of Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, Pippin, and Merry, which Frodo and Sam weren't there for. Even if they spoke to others about what happened, there's no way that everyone could remember the exact sequence of events as described in this book. The way Pippin wielded his sword in the heat of battle, or the exact words people used, or how everyone was feeling and thinking at any given time. It's hard to do that with your own memories, let alone someone else's. Inherently, what's written cannot be exactly what happened. There have to be omissions, mistakes, or outright misrepresentations of what people said, thought, or did, whether Frodo intended it or not. And I mean, all of this just gets even murkier when we account for the bias of the Gondorian scholars, or Frodo and Bilbo themselves. The Hobbit is probably the closest we have to events as they happened, because it's a first-hand account that doesn't deviate from Bilbo's perspective that much. But even then, we know that the first version Bilbo wrote of meeting Gollum was not true. Now, it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. To them, his account was that Gollum had promised to give him a present if he won the game. This account Bilbo set down in his memoirs, and he never seemed to have altered it himself. It still appeared in the original Red Book, as it did in several copies and abstracts. But many copies contain the true account as an alternative, derived no doubt from the notes of Frodo and Samwise, both of whom learned the truth, though they seem to have been unwilling to delete anything actually written by the old Hobbit himself. Now, in the real world, the reason for this is that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit before he quite knew what the role of the One Ring would be in The Lord of the Rings, which he wrote later on. So, earlier publications of The Hobbit were written differently, but he uses this inconsistency as a part of his world building. It's that meta world building coming back where he uses an awareness of the text and how it is written to tell us something about the world. Perhaps Bilbo wanted to make himself look better by having Gollum give it up willingly and not show Bilbo being manipulated by the ring. And this is only one example, because we don't know what else might have been twisted, misremembered, misunderstood, biased, or which details might have been omitted or forgotten. And then later on, things get lost in translation, from Sindarin Elvish to Westron to modern English. Tolkien actually wrote an entire piece in the appendices on the supposed challenges of translating the Red Book, including, and this is gonna be disconcerting, so I apologize for bringing this upon you, but the Hobbits' real names are not Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, forgive me, but Mora, Ban, Razar, and Kali. And the word Hobbit, doesn't exist. He came up with that by himself, apparently. The real word that was used is Kuduk. Yeah, Kuduk. Which feels just so unimaginably wrong. The appendices are actually full of different authors leaving notes on the mistakes of previous translators or the original writers. And all of this brings us to an inevitable conclusion, that no matter how close Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo got, it's still a fictionalized account of what really happened in Middle-earth. The truth is, Lord of the Rings is one of those inspired by true events stories. The stories of Middle-earth, it seems, are subject to the same historiography challenges that we face in our world. And I've been thinking about what that might mean for the story itself. Like, for example, this may be why Aragorn comes across as such a paragon, a perfect man, the paragon of a king. He seems almost too good a king to be true from the start, and this may come from Frodo's perspective, seeing him as a righteous person constantly defending the weak, or perhaps from Aragorn's own changes, his scholars who made additions to later copies, wanting to be seen as ready to step up to kinghood from the beginning when he may not have been in reality. In a kind of oxymoronic way, canonically, the canon is kind of wrong. There will be things that happened that we didn't see, or things that did happen that didn't. Characters given credit for things they didn't do or did say, and characters will be slightly off from what the real fictional people were like. Or even wildly off in some cases. We just don't know. I mean, think about how traumatizing having the One Ring across that entire journey would be. How much did it warp Frodo's perception of others and events and himself? He seems to have even dissociated at points. It seems like that in the book. This all gets a bit complicated though when we get to the Silmarillion, or the Book of Lost Tales, or Children of Hurin, which tell the stories of the Elder Days. the creation of the world, duels between elves and gods, mighty heroes who fall from grace, underdogs who achieve greatness, and pivotal, mythical moments of history. And it reads like that. But Eärendil came in his ship, Vingelot, from the starless voids, shining with a white flame at the helm. The dragon turned in the sky to face his foe. Then, before the rising of the sun, Eärendil struck on Celegon the Black, the mightiest of the dragon host, and cast him from the sky. And he fell upon the towers of Thangorodrim, and they were broken in his ruin. Wow. My question is, what does that sound like to you? For me, it's like reading the Old Testament, and that's because it kind of is. These were supposedly written by Bilbo translating books about this stuff in Rivendell and taking the accounts of elves who may have even remembered these events or had second or third hand accounts. Elrond, after all, had been around for all of the Second Age. But this is another level of abstraction between the events and them being recorded. Bilbo is writing about this stuff thousands of years after it happened, probably with misremembered, possibly biased, second, third, fourth, fifth-hand accounts. And I reckon that is why the Silmarillion reads like this. Much like our own ancient stories take on a mythical, larger-than-life account, I reckon the Silmarillion inherited a more legendary version of events than actually happened, or actually fictionally happened. So when it talks about how Fingolfin single-handedly took Morgoth on, dealing him 7 wounds, with Morgoth described as tall as a mountain wades in the sea and has its head above the clouds, maybe Morgoth wasn't quite that big, or Fingolfin wasn't alone, but they wanted to highlight his heroism. If you actually read the dialogue in the Silmarillion, it doesn't read like normal people speak. It feels more pointed for thematic or moral reasons. Like in the Bible, there's a poetic nature to how everything is written, which isn't so much the case in The Lord of the Rings, but definitely is the case in the Silmarillion and the other Elder Days books. For example, the number 7 is used repeatedly in the Silmarillion, and these poeticisms may mean that what is conveyed is more poetic than true to what happened. In the spirit of history more than history itself, maybe it wasn't 7 wounds. I mean, who was counting? But they picked that number because they didn't quite know, and well, it holds thematic meaning to them. I just think this is a fascinating example of meta world building, using the text itself and how it's written to tell us more about the characters and world inside the stories. Tolkien wasn't the first one to do this, but it adds a touch of authenticity to his work when he creates a meta-narrative like this, in which he and us, you and me, are even part of a story stretching back into Middle-earth history. Maybe you want to do something similar with yours, who knows? World building like Tolkien means creating and keeping track of a lot of information, and I'm sure that he had tons of files and papers to do so. But luckily, we don't have to type everything up on a typewriter anymore. Instead, we have things like Campfire. It's got pages for tracking world histories, cultures, languages, religions, magic systems, character profiles, a manuscript editor to write in, timelines, and an encyclopedia. Is it for you? Well, honestly, the best way to find out is to simply try it for free yourself. Seriously, having a framework that prompts you to ask questions like what are the limitations of your magic system, or where do your characters travel to on the map and how long should that take, are important to helping you keep track of this stuff, to be aware. I genuinely really like the character profiles that Campfire has, and the language program is really genius. I've done full reviews of it before, covering Campfire's strengths and weaknesses, and they're linked up in the corner if you want to go watch them. But really, just try it for yourself down at the link below. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.